This is the Culture Change Paradoxes webinar series from Onefish Webinar, and I'm Carrie Bedingfield. Culture is a complex system where many different elements interact with each other and where outcomes are not predictable. And even if it were possible to follow all the steps in the great book you've just read or the slideshare you found online, you will almost certainly not get the outcome in the big change project plan that you wrote at the start. Onefish Webinar has been helping organisations become faster, more agile, more high trust, more collaborative for 13 years. And what's clear in a complex system like this is that it doesn't consistently respond to modern management techniques. In this series, we will share what we've learnt about what culture does respond to. And you will hear conversations with our extended team, which will help put a language to some of the paradoxes you've probably already been experiencing, and conversations that might help you plan and execute your work differently, talk to the business about it differently, and even change your view about what the goal is. The Culture Change Paradoxes webinar series is for people at mastery level. Full notes will be shared with the recording afterwards, so any technical terminology, any references to people or other links and resources will be shared. And today we're going to start opening this season with a conversation with Richard Atherton.
Hello.
So Richard is currently the change agent for the BBC. He's a partner at First Human and he's part of our extended Onefish Webinar team. And in opening this series, he's offered to go hardcore on change. So put that in your Twitter feed on a Friday morning. Hi, Richard.
Hello. So nice to be here.
Tell us, Richard, first of all, so why is culture change so painful and what could be exciting about that?
Okay, so why is it so painful? I think the first challenge I'd make there is that culture change can be painful for some people some of the time. And of course, sometimes culture change can be delightful for people and can be welcome and liberating and wonderful. So why is it painful for some people some of the time? I think there's no single answer to that. It can be a threat to identity, a threat to power, a threat to relationships, a challenge to one's values. It could be triggering in some way to an individual in terms of what they've been through in their past, in their childhood. Even so, I think such is the complexity of individual human beings, that a change in their environment can have this is what we say from the complexity perspective, is that it can have predictable and unpredictable effects. Any change can have predictable and unpredictable effects.
So tell us more about that. You just touched on the magic word, complexity theory. Do you want to talk us through that?
Talk us through complexity theory. So, what can we say about it? I suppose it's, I suppose there's a history of complexity thinking which has its roots in philosophy, certainly as it applies to human beings. It roots in philosophy and sociology, but there's also complexity science in terms of modelling techniques, particularly of complex adaptive systems, where we're starting to get insights from those modelling environments in terms of what happens. Hello, Sana. With what effects emerge from those modelling out of complex adaptive systems. So those two insights from both of those fields combine into a body of work, if you like, around complexity. And there are specific writers who have attempted to think about how that applies to organisations, to leadership, to change, and so on.
And as change agents or people who are responsible for somehow shifting a culture from one state to another in an organisation, what can we understand from complexity that helps make sense of that world? What would you draw our attention to?
Well, first of all, to challenge the idea that we can move at something from one state to another. So, from a complexity perspective, we well, at least let's take it from the perspective of Ralph Stacey, who's a complexity thinker who's had a lot of influence on me, and he describes this notion of transformative causality, and that's the idea that as individuals we are being formed and forming our environment in an ongoing dynamical process. He calls it complex responsive processes, or that exist and persist in populations of human beings. And so to that extent, it's sort of meaningless to talk about this state and that state because we're continually forming and being formed by our environments, and within that context patterns emerge, and it's in recognizing those patterns that we gain some level of predictability, but equally events occur and phenomena occur in ways that don't form patterns and that are as such not predictable. So we have predictability, we have and unpredictability simultaneously.
So that sounds like a message to me that the board are just not going to stomach. So sorry about this, but we can no longer move from one thing to another because we're all forming and reforming, and oopsie, I'm out of a job. So in the context of an organisation which has rightly or wrongly, has a vision, a set of strategic priorities, probably multiple work streams of change programs that are going on, how on earth do you kind of smash together those things? How would you begin to use just a bit of that insight that you've shared about the unpredictability and pattern spotting to do anything real in a real organisation?
So, well, there's two things in what you said here. There's this idea of setting goals and having visions and so on, and it's not to say that those can't have an impact. So it's not to say that by sharing an aspiration or a desire to go in a particular direction, that can't have some impact on the population of humans you share it with, right? So it is. So it's not like those statements are meaningless. It's simply to say that they will be taken up and interpreted by those who receive them in ways that may be predictable and unpredictable. But it's still going to have some impact. So we're not saying don't have a vision, don't have aspirations, don't have goals, because they may have some impact in the environment you're working in. And then the second point about what we're saying, what can we do that's real? I think there is something to be said for having our feelers open and sensing for what's emerging and saying, well, there seems to be a lot of stories in this organization that pertain to, let's say, customer experience or employee experience. There seems to be there is this theme or that theme, and articulating that back to the group may have meaning and may be real for people, and that may be useful data and information to move forward with. You know, if we get a collection of stories which seem to center around a particular frustration, that is real at some level. And if we can call it, and is our job as change agents and leaders is our ability to articulate that, then we can have impact in that conversation, and we can allow some new conversation to emerge.
So Dave Snowden, and I think he takes this from somebody else's book actually, but he would say, as a leader, as you hear negative stories arise, rather than trying to refute them, instead make them visible, but then take small actions that make those stories more difficult to tell. And he talks about story triggering. And I wonder, as practical change agents, if you think about your work at the BBC and so many interesting organisations, what would you do with that story piece? What would you literally do in practice?
Okay, so you want to find ways to articulate those stories in a way that's meaningful for the population. So what does that mean? So it might be, I don't know, putting a wall up and finding some way to present the different stories verbatim if you can, to provide the raw data and some way of showing a pattern, or drawing some conclusions, or making some statements about what you think is emerging in the culture. So this set of stories suggests to us that this is true, and given that this is true, we believe that one experiment we could make, which would allow us to have, and I think this is what David is alluding to have less stories like this, is X. What do you think? Should we try that? And so that would be a way of practically dealing with the stories that are emerging in the environment, and make them visible in some way, attempt to make sense of them and come to the conclusions, and then suggest some kind of a nudge or an experiment to have less or more stories of that nature, depending on the nature of the stories.
So this is really interesting. So it sounds like if the premise is that we cannot control an organisation and shift it from one state to another, and that it is constantly forming and reforming with these emergent properties, what can we do? Well, we can start to make some of those patterns visible to everybody and to help everybody make sense of them. So I picked up a few other things there, one of which is that old way might be that part of the business collects a load of stories, takes them away, makes sense of them, plays them back to the organisation, or makes some decisions based on the meaning they've derived from them. New way is a change agent is responsible for making those stories available to everybody, so everybody can derive meaning and learning from them, and the group can learn together. So bringing the processing and use of those stories right into the heart of the people who have created them and are part of them in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's one particular shift. Yeah, so the paradigm of hoovering, the bureaucracy hoovering up all of those stories into the centre, trying to make sense of them, and then pushing down some initiatives as part of some change plan. In some ways, it's a similar process, but I suppose what we say is we take some of the aspects of that process, but push it more into the people who are most likely to be able to make sense of those stories, and suggest nudges or probes, to use the lexicon, within that team or that division, that those involved think might result in there being less or more stories. But then you want to, in real time, monitor what now emerges, because if we take the perspective of this idea of an ongoing forming and reforming, then in the act of carrying out the experiment, something else is going to emerge that we may be able to predict or not, or we may not be able to predict. But the point is to be continually sensing. So it's the idea of the sort of annual survey where we take the snapshot, we design our initiatives, we roll our initiatives out, and then we take another snapshot a year later. Doesn't really make sense in the context of some of the complexity thinking.
So this is interesting, and let's talk about that sensing piece. So in Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organisations, which some people come to Onefish Twofish events kind of clutching a copy of and waving quite high in the air, he describes in some detail how, or makes a real case for why and how you would move away from a measuring and monitoring type of organisation and a kind of achievement or oriented organisation towards a sensing organisation, and the idea that we are human sensing machines, capable human beings being excellent at handling complexity if they're provided with the right conditions. Can you tell us a bit more about what that sensing organisation might look like and why it matters?
So what it looks like and why it matters. So I think I think let's start with why it matters and then maybe what it looks like. So what I think why it matters is because if we accept the premise that we've got this continually changing organization, then why does it matter to sense? It's because it allows us to make better decisions. It allows us to have more impact in the world because it's clearer to us what's real. So it allows us to have a better grasp on reality, and to the extent to which we've got a better grasp on reality, that it is true that we can make better decisions, more impactful decisions. So I think that's the why of it, and the what of it is. So an organizational level, I think there are some things you could say at an organizational level, and maybe I'll come to that. But I think at an individual level, it means developing one's ability to listen, developing one's ability to own one's own impact on the space or on the set of conversations that you're having. So that ability to be self-reflective and reflexive. If you take this has come from Stacey's thinking. So that's this idea that not only can I think about what it is I'm doing and reflect on what it is I'm doing, I can think about how I think about how I'm doing it, right? But to summarize it, it's just this ability to step back. Detached involvement is another term that's used. So this idea that I'm part of this, like I can't stand outside of it. So this is rejecting some of the sort of, let's say, Kantian philosophy of what this idea that I'm a sort of rational human who can somehow step out of the system. That's what we reject from a complexity perspective. We say you're always part of this ongoing forming and being formed by. But nonetheless, I can still reflect on my experience, and I can own to the extent I can really understand it. But I can own my impact. How it is that my gestures, that my reactions have changed what's around me. So those are a couple of things. And I think another thing is this idea of having a skill of facilitating free-flowing conversations. So one of the ways that we can detect and sense for patterns that are emerging is to allow for a free-flowing conversation and then watch what emerges. And the tendency in organizations is not to say that structured conversations aren't useful in some contexts. It's not to say that it's never useful to have an agenda or it's never useful to have a highly managed set of conversations. Absolutely, it can be. But when we're specifically looking to make sense, then actually free-flowing conversations can be better. So no agenda, open conversation, and having the skill to allow that to happen can be a tool in the armory of making sense of what's emerging within a population.
It strikes me that for many organisations who feel they are trying to, some great cliches here, trying to do more with less, trying to respond to big change in the market, trying to shift their own culture, whether or not we think that's possible, that the idea of having enough space to have a free-flowing conversation is just unthinkable. If I think about some of our clients, if I went and said, the thing we need to do next, or like our top priorities is to get lots of people together and have a free-flowing conversation, that would be so alien to them, it would make no sense. So how can you start to allow people to express, listen, spot patterns in a way that's not completely countercultural to this rush that they're in as an organisation?
It's a great...
Have you got any examples of where you've done that?
Yeah. So I think there's ways to do it by stealth. So let's just take a really small example of working with a big retailer who had very typical meeting structure, and they always had this AOB. Like most steering committees or formal meetings, there's the AOB section. And so one of the things I did there was I hijacked that AOB session, which actually is often the place where these free-flowing conversations happen. but by sort of radically reducing a lot of the bureaucracy in the earlier part of the meeting, we were able to shrink that section of the meeting down. And then for the AOB, change the dynamic of the conversation. So it wasn't the chair of the meeting saying, okay, who's got something they want to raise? I took on the role as a facilitator rather than the person with the most authority in the room of kind of crowdsourcing a set of topics and then having people talk to each topic in a time box fashion. But it allowed for, and I know that sounds like it's not so free flowing, but it did allow for a lot more of topics to emerge and a lot more voices to emerge in the conversation. In a way that did feel like it was much more free flowing. And out of that, we often got the best data at that section of the meeting. And once people started to see it, you might get a few people who, having experienced that, think, oh, actually, yeah, maybe we should make more space for this because it helps us to understand the environment better.
I mean, that sounds very like taking some of the principles of open space technology and just sort of inspiring an existing meeting, just making a few tweaks to making it to imbue a current meeting of some kind with the qualities and characteristics of an open space type conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So it's finding kind of gaps, where the ice is thin. Okay, maybe here I can try something, I can probe something. So and turn taking is important. So that's another, if there's a way to structure conversations so that you can allow for more turn taking, it just gives you more data. It gives you more sensors. I mean, Snowden has this idea of the human sensor, and so when we're trying to map culture or organizations or populations, we treat each human as a sensor. So how do we get data from the sensor? That's a sort of slightly utilitarian, arguably slightly scary way of viewing it, but I do like that idea. It's like, how can I ping all of these sensors to get some data from them?
No.
So creating structures which sort of, at some level, enforce turn taking is useful.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds very close to my heart and part of what our meeting product Lomo is trying to do. And I wonder if you can kind of put language to that better than I can. So we, intuitively we know that participation is important. It's not a new thing to say, well, let's have a meeting where everybody gets a chance to say what they think. We know that's completely different from real data sensing as you describe it. We also know that traditionally we've thought of communication as being 70% content, so literally the words that you say, and plus 30%, or whatever the kind of exact number might be, as being about, often it's been termed as body language. So kind of picking up the body language. And my belief has always been that there's far more to it than body language and even than tone of voice, that humans are good at receiving data face to face, probably far more than they could put into words. And I wonder if you could suggest what some of those things might be. Like, what are we sensing when we hear somebody speak face to face?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, that isn't something I've done a huge amount of thinking on, in terms of what do we really take on when we interact face to face with people. There is probably a lot more than often gets described. I know there's some research that's done that suggests that some certain mechanical engineers literally develop a smell, and they can smell whether an engine or a piece of equipment has got something wrong with it. So
Really?
odor might be more important than we think it is, for example. So but that's a great question, and I've got to be honest there. Certainly my intuition is that we get that there's a lot more data available when we're face to face, and also I think it's interesting to think about, is talking always the best medium? I did a lot of work with one group, and one session we ran as a Lego serious play session, And that was interesting that there was one individual in this group. And for those who don't know Lego Serious Play, it's using Lego in a serious way to explore complex problems. But that's great for turn taking because most people feel confident to try and build something. And this one individual who would never engage in any kind of talk-based environments, and even if we had stickies and post-its, was generally fairly reluctant. But once we had this Lego-based conversation, she was fully engaged and built this great model, and then actually in that context did feel able to talk more and tell the story of her model. But even to an extent, we could already see with our eyes a lot of what it is she was trying to communicate to us. So that's also something to consider, as well as that talking may not be the only medium to explore when trying to make sense of people's stories and narratives, and what it is that they've got to share.
Can I take you over to an area that you've mentioned a couple of times, which is experiments? So many of the things we talked about so far, I think, will inherently resonate with people listening and watching, but trying to describe that as a job. So the reality is we live within a commercial system. Will an organisation pay for somebody to allow the organisation to explore emergent patterns in stories? That's not a job title yet. I'm sure it will be. So as in the commercial world, we're just socialising some of these ideas. But the word you've said several times so far, and I know is part of our kind of shared lexicon of how do you take steps in practice that are tangible and create some kind of outcome that is helpful, is to use an experiment. So can you talk more about the concept of experiment as it applies to change agents?
Yeah. So what can we say about experiments? I mean, in a sense, all change projects are experiments. It's just, so whether we consciously or not, everything we do at some level is an experiment. So really, we're just bringing consciousness to what sort of is already true in all of our work. And so there's a few elements of it. I think one is the idea that we have a hypothesis. So we take the sort of humility of a scientist and say, we're not sure that what we're going to try here is going to have the particular outcome, but we hypothesize that by doing X, Y will happen, Y will emerge. So that's the first part of it, is to switch how we think about the interventions that we make into something which accepts to some degree of unpredictability of our environment. I think that's the first thing to say. And then the second thing to say is to think about then, well, how do we manage, if you like, around this experiment? The first is to think about, well, what if it's successful? How would we amplify the impacts? And what if it's not? What if there's some unintended consequence, or just something that we may have considered that might happen? Well, how do we dampen a potential negative impact? So those are a couple of things to think about. The other thing to talk about, and this may not always be appropriate, but if we're thinking about maximizing the chance of this experiment being taken up or engaged with, then how do we make it visible? How do we, Stacey, again, one of these complexity things, thinks about these gestures that we make, and you could think about an experiment as a gesture to a population of humans, or a social object, right, that we sort of put into this dynamic. Is how do you get as many people engaging with it? So make it visible, get other people involved to co-create the experiment, and then they can share their story of what this experiment is about with those around them. So there are ways to maximize the chance of it actually being executed as an experiment and taken up by the population. And then, of course, then you want to think about, well, how are we going to sense for the outcome? How are we going to sense for what people make of it, and what happens afterwards?
So it's interesting you say that. I've started putting in virtually every positioning slide deck I do a slide quite early on that says life is an experiment, and has a clearly hilarious picture of some kind of scientific experiment happening in the 1920s, and some, you know, nice speech bubbles with it. And I'm starting to badge everything as an experiment in an attempt to, I'm really saying I come in peace. You know, we're just here to try something and see what works, and you can, the implication being, you can decide, use what's useful and discard what isn't, which is what people will do anyway. Can you describe the characteristics of a great experiment? So what does a good experiment look like?
Well, I suppose it's one that's had some impact, because the worst kind of experiment is one where you don't really know if it succeeded or it failed.
So how would you design an experiment?
So I can give an example of a failed experiment, and it failed not because it didn't. So I was working with a group of journalists, and one of the things that the challenges that they had was that they felt like they were kind of behind the curve in terms of infographics, right? So that's a thing now in journalism, is that, you know, visual journalism. And so the experiment was, let's create a guild of infographians, if that's a word, right? So let's create this guild, and let's create this center of excellence, and then perhaps by doing that we're going to increase the level of output of infographics in our work, and people will have a resource to draw on to create them, and so on. So, okay, let's run an experiment over, let's say, 3 months. Let's set up this guild that's put some resource into it, and then we can monitor it in terms of number of infographics produced and the impact that those infographics have, let's say, on social media. So we had a few metrics that we might want to look at, and we had some ideas around how we'd set it up. Now you can just say that sounds just like a project. In a sense it is, you know, right? But we're just being conscious about the fact it's an experiment, because maybe this isn't the best way to go about improving the output or increasing the output of infographics. Now that everybody was on board with this, we co-created it. The head of the news desk was behind it and was part of the creating of it. Went out of the room, and the person who was nominated to lead it, and who had said in the session, "Yeah, I'll lead it," didn't run with it. Just didn't get the time from her manager, and for whatever reason decided not to run with it. So it never happened. So we never got to know whether the guild of infographics was going to succeed or fail. So I think in some ways that's the worst type of experiment, one that never actually gets executed. I say that's what I've learned from this, is that from working in this way, is that in some senses you still need the rigor that we learned from project management, which is you got to put some support behind it and some resourcing behind it to ensure it actually gets executed. I mean, another example of an experiment, which is a good experiment in the sense that it failed, was there was this particular group I was working with, and they had an issue as they perceived it with self-esteem. There was lower self-esteem in this group, and so I suggested, well, maybe we should use kudo cards, which are, for those who don't know, they're like little postcards, and you write, you know, Carrie was awesome today for doing X, or Richard did a great job at this, and then you stick it on a wall, and people are publicly acknowledged. And this was my idea. This was going to improve the esteem of the group, and I suggested it a couple of times, and then finally brought in this set of cards and said to the leader of this team, right, we're going to do it. And she sort of flipped and said, "F off with your hippie shit," and told me to, bog off with my kudo cards. So that was a kind of, in a sense, I'd pushed it as far as I could, and I'd experimented with, set it up, and felt, and I'd learned, you know, it was this kind of slightly clumsy and unfortunate way that I learned, but that was me attempting something and falling flat and getting data from the group, which is, you know, they're not ready to try that, you know, for whatever reason, her individually or perhaps more in the group, were just not in a place where that was going to be the thing that was going to work for them. But it was a success in the sense that I tested it and got a very clear piece of feedback. I hope that makes sense. It's where you can actually test something and get some data back and make some sense of whether it might have worked or not.
So if we assume that these experiments need to have really, really clear outcomes, they probably need to be quite on fairly short time frames. So if you're going to fail, you want to fail within a couple of weeks rather than spend 18 months failing. But I come back to the issue around time and resource. So you and I worked on a big culture change program, well designed, recently designed to help people find experiments and do them. And there was great energy at the 2-day event, at which we did a lot of co-creation and design of those experiments. Quite a sense of community, I think, coming out of that, and a sense of we've really got a new way to think about things and something that's much more doable than the old way. And but then what happened was people had no specific time carved out from it. There was no reduction in any of their other goals or deliverables in their role. And the time, we ended up with perhaps 25 people with very, 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 very thin bands of time available. And so even doing something really simple like changing the way a Skype for Business meeting is run was just too much to do. So what would be your thoughts and recommendations about how people can, how the organisation can create the conditions in which people have enough time and energy to do an experiment?
Yeah, so I think there you've got to find somebody who's got the authority to give people space and is really committed to the idea. So that, I think that's what I've learned, is that, yeah, organisations are in differing states of readiness to adopt this as a philosophy, and I think that's largely dependent on those with authority over people's time. To what extent, as you say, can they create the conditions where people have space to do it? And so that would be always where I would try and work in future, and what I do now a lot more. I'm much more conscious of this now with clients. Is like, well, it's no good me coming in as a change agent and suggesting that people and encourage people to take on experiment and co-create them with them if they don't have any space to do it. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is sometimes we have if we as change agents are engaged with a client, it may be only us who have the latitude, right? So because I'm not employed generally by clients on a sort of 9 to 5 days a week type basis, I often have the privileged position and to have a little bit more latitude over time and resources and able to, and I am able to set experiments up in a slightly different way. And then if people can experience the benefit of that, they can then become evangelists within the organization. So that's the other thing to do, is quite often I'll work with change agents and coach other change agents, and they'll say, and they'll design all these experiments that require other people to lead them. And what I try and encourage us to do, well, what about you? Could you design one that only needs you and your time and your energy, and start there?
It's interesting that the person who commissioned that project, or that piece of work in the organisation we worked with, she was really, I think she played a really inspirational role. She's very low key, very kind of, she's on the board, warm, easygoing person. And what she did is she used her physical presence, i.e. where she put her desk, where she sat, who she worked with, what she talked about. Before we even started generating ideas, she was clearly and openly experimenting with her own ways of working in quite a low-key, unshowy way. And I think that seemed to make a big difference to people's kind of acceptance of a different way of doing things. but also it set the tone for the scale of things that you might do that might make a difference, i.e. pretty small, how some small things can make a huge difference.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, modeling it. And the other thing is to sort of come back big picture again and to look at, okay, some of the causes of people's busyness, right? And why they may not have spaces to really look at workload. And there's a guy called Finn Golding, who's the CIO of Aviva, the big insurer, and he's written a couple of books. One's called Flow, and the other one's called, I think, 12 Steps to Implementing Flow. But his big thing is visualization, and one of the ways he uses visualization is to visualize the number of projects that exist within an organization, and then is really big on managing work in progress. So he's all about, let's visualize what we've got, let's get clear about the reality of what we've taken on, and let's ruthlessly cut it down to a small amount of work that people have got, which doesn't fill their week. And so in that sense, he's seeking to systemically reduce workload for individuals to give them space to experiment.
Interesting. And but just as a heads up to those listening, I'm going to ask if there are any questions in a couple of minutes. So have a think about what they might be, and you could pop them in the chat or ask them directly. In the meantime, Richard, you've just talked about, just headed us in the direction of leaders, and can you just give us your thoughts on the role, what do leaders need to do to themselves, with others, to create the conditions in which more helpful patterns of culture can emerge?
Yeah. Well, so that's one, I think from what I just mentioned, so taking an active role. If we're specifically talking about the experimental aspect of what we've talked about in terms of complexity, so because of course it might be that somebody is fully engaged in a single experiment, and that's entirely consistent with what we're talking about. But to the extent that people need space beyond their day job, if you like, to experiment, and that's one thing to do, is to be a truth teller in that sense of what's really going on and what people really committed to, and cutting out the waste. And so I think there's a lot to learn from all of the lean thinking there. It's some phenomenal number of employee suggested experiments that Toyota engage in on an annual basis. I don't have the stat in front of me, but it's just mind-blowing, like the number of employee-based suggestions that Toyota takes up, each year, way beyond any of their peers. So there is that managing waste as a leader, and then what we've talked about as an interpersonal level. So that ability to facilitate open conversations, make space for those open conversations. There's a brilliant anecdote in this book that I mentioned by Stacey called Strategic Management and Organizational Dynamics, about a case study in the NHS where they had this problem with elderly people falling, right? So falls within wards. It was mainly elderly, it was falls in general, but predominantly elderly people. And their first attempt at tackling this problem was to set a bunch of goals around how many falls that they wanted to have, obviously less falls on an annual basis, set of action plans and training plans, the sort of traditional change approach to this. And initially they had a big impact, like 15% drop in falls or something. But then the falls, I think a year later, the falls went back up to their original level. So the whole, in what is quite familiar to many of us working in corporate knows, is the entire change initiative failed. So they took a second attempt, and they took one experienced nurse, took her out of her day job, and said, okay, your job is to rotate around the nursing teams and facilitate reflective conversations with each team about how that team can reduce the number of falls. And the skill of that nurse was to create a space where people could openly share about, because some of the behavior was quite shameful from these nurses, from what I understand. They felt ashamed of how they were behaving and how that might have contributed to falls. So creating it's a bit of a buzzword right now, but the psychological safety for these conversations happening in an open way was key, from what I understand, to this particular nurse's work. And the turn taking and the free flowing conversation, and presumably that nurse as well owning her impact on that space. All of those things I'd alluded to before, she was, as I understand it, exhibiting in her role there as facilitator of these reflective conversations. And what they found was this approach dramatically reduced the number of falls in a sustained way. So that for me is a great example of what we mean by leadership.
Wow.
In this context.
It strikes me how many of the things you've talked about are understated, they're low tech, they're not particularly shiny, and in fact your shiniest example, the Kudo cards, were thrown back in your thrown back into the shiny drawer, and it just strikes me that this is my final big question for you, probably unanswerable, but give it a go, is that if we think about the kind of people who lead organisations, the mindset and models they've grown up with, many of them very emotionally intelligent and very tuned in, but still this doesn't feel like leadership to many people. This won't feel like leadership. So is it that we've got the wrong leaders? Can they shift to a different way? Do we need different leaders? Like, what's the bigger implication?
Yeah, I suppose it, to some extent, it is reframing what we mean by leadership. I remember going into actually it was this retailer I mentioned, and did a huge amount of work in terms of transforming how we worked as a change. And it wasn't, I was, again, I was gesturing to this population, some of which were taken up in ways that had an impact. But I remember somebody afterwards saying, "Oh yeah, Richard, we really love all that communication stuff you do." And I was sort of incessant. I was like, "This is, as far as I was concerned, in my ego, I was engaging in leadership, not communications." But I can really see how, from a certain perspective, what this looks like is, facilitation and communication, and in a sense it is. But I suppose what we're talking about is reframing some of those skills that get badged in that way to being more about leadership. But it's tricky because we're all wired to some extent to be very conscious of where we sit in power hierarchies and where we sit in an authoritative ladder. And if we perceive that engaging in these types of activities and developing these skills is not going to help us to progress up a hierarchy, then we're not, many of us a lot of the time are not going to go there. So it's complex.
Isn't it? So at this point, let me invite any questions from people currently watching or listening. So feel free to unmute yourself or to put a question into the chat box. I'm just having a moment of silent reflection and allowing the free-flowing conversation to emerge. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Richard privately or offline, then please do. So you can either put it into the chat to either of us privately or into the group, or you can email either of us. And Richard, what would you leave as a final thought for somebody who's got one foot in the corporate world, so one foot firmly on the payroll at an organisation that is pointing in the right direction but doesn't really get all this stuff quite yet, and another foot firmly in this understanding of culture as an emergent system with emergent properties, where it isn't possible to guarantee an outcome or to apply the same modern management techniques that we've been driving businesses with for the last 100 years. So what would be your reflection for those people?
I think one thing that really shifted for me in terms of sort of reconciling these two worldviews is that I think it's the phrase speaking into people's values. So, like, if somebody really values their sense of certainty and their belief in, I don't know, the value of detailed planning, or the value of structure, the value of, the hierarchy, or whatever it might be for them, is, I think, where I've been most successful is where I've really seek to take on their value set and said, okay, well, if this was what was dear to me, and this was what I really wanted in the world, and this is what I wanted to see, how could I present what it is that I've got to offer such that it's completely consistent with what they value? So how can I, from the perspective I've got, frame whatever it is I've got to offer as something that's going to have them have even more of what they currently have? And that feels like it's an impossible task. But when I come from that place, I think I get much closer to designing interventions that are effective. That's my thought.
Wonderful, wonderful. And that speaks directly to one of our biggest principles at Onefish Twofish, which is meet people where they are right now, not where we want them to be or where the thought leadership suggests people could be, but start with what people are ready for right now and use their worldview to frame it. Thank you so much, Richard. You can find Richard on Twitter at RathertonRich. I am at C Beddingfield. We are at Onefish Comms. The recording for this will be available on the onefishcomms.co.uk website and also via Twitter within the next week. And we have a full remainder of this season to continue with 4 more speakers over the next 4 weeks. So looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.